The goal of content is not attention. The goal of content is intentional attention. Well, we want the best founders in the world to think of GTMfund first. And it's not a nice to have, it's a need to have.
If the sole goal is just attention, it's like we could create memes, we could create funny content. But when I move in market 7 months from now, because I'm out of contract with a competitor and I'm evaluating other options, do I think of you in that scenario?
It's very easy to create content, but can you actually attach that content to what you do without it being too far kind of down the funnel, if you will, since we're serving the 95%, so that when they're in a position, they already have that attachment queue.
How do you set your content goals in terms of like subscribers to the newsletter or podcast, listens and downloads?
From a planning perspective, I operate on a quarterly basis. So I will look at
Let's get into some content and some marketing strategy conversation here. So for those that don't know, you're the VP of marketing at GTMfund, which is a VC fund. It's an interesting model. So essentially it's got two sides, like the early stage VC, fund model, but also a lot of the investors in the network of the GTM fund are GTM experts. And so that is a major differentiator, obviously. I'm sure you could, explain it even better than me. But yeah, within that context, one of the goals I'm assuming you all have is how do we get founders to be aware of us and want to reach out to us when they're looking for funding, and the best companies choose to work with us? Maybe when there's multiple term sheets, being put out there, it's like, why would somebody pick GTMfund, over the others? And a big part of that, I think, would be the trust that you all have built with your expertise and with your content, that like these people get us and get how they can help us grow. So yeah, would love to kind of talk about all of that, really just from a big picture. But yeah, did I get that mostly right, or anything you would add there context wise?
Yeah, you nailed it. No, that's exactly right. Essentially, the whole part of the thesis at GTMfund is that capital is a commodity. So you touched on that nicely around what is that differentiator? So capital is a commodity, or becoming a commodity, especially for the best founders out there. And so they really need that value add beyond capital. And ultimately, technology modes are declining, particularly now with AI, and they're becoming obsolete. The best product doesn't always win. Above everything, the difference and kind of the moat that remains is go to market. And that's exactly kind of what we support with through our operator-led model. So we're an early stage B2B SaaS venture firm, so investing at the pre-seed to Series A stages. And we have that unique operator-led model where we're backed by over 300 of, the best go-to-market executives that have kind of been there, done that, if you will, at some of the best fast-growing tech companies out there. So they really lead with firsthand experience, helping with our portfolio company support, helping with media amplification from their insights. That's a lot of the premise behind our media company, is how do we actually disseminate and distribute the insights that are talked about from portfolio company to operators that happen behind closed doors? How can we extend that support to others? So that's a huge kind of differentiator for GTMfund.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it's, from there, it's taking that, which is a really nice differentiated positioning just from like a business model perspective, or like a VC model perspective, that then can be parlayed into your all's content as well. And so yeah, maybe we could get into that a little bit in terms of like how you think about content. I know you've got GTM Now, which is essentially like your media property that a lot of your content like lives underneath. You've got the GTM podcast. You all are very active on social. And so, yeah, a big thing that we talk about on this show is like essentially trying to create a relationship with those future buyers. And then obviously in this case, it would be the future founders that you all would fund well before they're at that moment of need where they're like, okay, I'm actually looking for a solution right now. Like we want them to already have, in your case, be listening to the GTM podcast for the last 12 months, 18 months, what have you. before their company's in a position to actually get funding from you all. And so, I'm calling that essentially what the name of the show is, like 95% content, essentially. So focusing on those 95% who are not in market at the moment. Is that how you think about things too? Or like, yeah, how are you thinking about your content strategy, I guess, overall as a starting point here?
Yeah, well, first of all, I love what you're doing with the show because that is the reality. 5% of buyers are actually in market. It really is that 95%. So I appreciate everything that you're doing to actually share the insights around how do we tackle that? How do we actually get a hold of those 95 and build that relationship and trust through content for when they are in that 5% buying position? So a little bit about our strategy, and it's a bit different than a kind of traditional VC firm in the sense that our content is very go-to-market focused.
Hmm.
We ourselves, we're all operators. We have a community of operators. And again, coming back to our thesis around go-to-market really is that moat. We live and breathe go-to-market on the daily, and that's what we want to help support founders with. So we do that when we work with portfolio companies, and we also do that through content. And so instead of more of a broad lens, and we do sometimes take a broad lens on the industry and so forth, and we share that through the newsletter and other assets, but we really focus also on tactical, kind of real talk content that helps founders and operators build, scale, and ultimately win right now. Tried and true practices, no fluff, tactical things that they can execute. So what that means when it comes to our 95% is it's really hard to measure, as you know, for the 95%. But thankfully, and hopefully this helps, anyone listening as they're trying to understand how to get buy-in and so forth around media is it works. And we are super blessed to have a general partner who has built and sold some of, the best media companies in B2B tech in the past. And so he intuitively gets it. And so, yes, while we have a lot of measurement criteria and attribution, I can speak to those as we go through, you do really need that buy-in and understanding that it is super powerful. And it's his background that's really helped us do that from not only a, hey, let's tack media on, it's really been part of the DNA. So back in
Mm.
2013, he started a media company called Sales Hacker. And then over the course of, 10 or so years, built it into a thriving digital media community, scaled it to over 175,000 members globally. And in 2018, he sold it to Outreach. So he saw the impact of media firsthand from that. And as we understood the impact of distribution, that helped form the thesis around the launch. And then we also started a newsletter and podcast when we launched the fund initially. And they both grew quicker than anticipated, actually, which proved the value in media and supporting GTM Fund and in any other kind of business in this context. And then serendipitously, or what have you, fate, if you want to call it, the option of actually buying back Sales Hacker opportunistically came up. And this was like a full circle moment, obviously, to reacquire a company that you once founded. So we actually reacquired it back in August of 2023 and relaunched it in January of 2024 after rolling it up under our media brand, which you nicely called out earlier, GTM Now.
Amazing. And yeah, it just really like hits home for me, this concept of like these content strategies work. Like you can look at any of them: newsletters, podcasts, YouTube, social, webinars, communities. All of that stuff works. Like there's lots and lot. If people want to look like in research case studies, there's actually a lot of case studies that you'll be able to find. So it's not a matter of if they will work. It's like, are you going to believe in it enough to actually like execute it in a really intentional, like not dip your toe in, like test and see if it works. And this is the advantage you were speaking to with Max coming from that background and it being baked into the DNA of GTM Fund. It's like that is such a good position to start from, because it's not like we have to prove that this works in like small incremental tests. It's like we already know this works. We just need to make sure we get it to work for us. Like we'll have to probably
Yeah.
iterate, along the way, but does the actual channel work and does the strategy work? That's not a question. It's just how long, do we need to kind of keep iterating? Like maybe our formats need to change over time, or we get feedback from the audience along the way that helps us like course correct 5% here, 5% there. But it's not this big fundamental. Do newsletters work to help drive business to GTM Fund? Like that question doesn't necessarily sound like it needs to be answered here, which is good.
Exactly. Yeah. And hopefully that's changing in the landscape overall. More and more people are realizing the power of media earlier and earlier. And for that 95%, I always think of it in terms of a few different layers. So,
Mm,
speaking to the 95%, there is the do people know me? Do
mhm,
they know that attachment to how I can help? And so those
mm,
are almost two different areas. It's very easy to create content, but can you actually attach that content to what you do without it being too far kind of down the funnel, if you will, since we're serving the 95%, so that when they're in a position, they already have that attachment cue, not just, yeah, I know their name, but what kind of use case is it? Will it help me? I think a really good example of this is how Mutiny runs their content. So in their
mm,
newsletter, they've got really educational content. It talks
mm,
to not just their product at all, it's more of the space. It's educating their buyers on how to create sales and marketing alignment, how to actually run ABM programs. But then at the very bottom of each newsletter, they say something along the lines of, forget what Mutiny does. This is what we do. And it's maybe two
mm.
lines at the very bottom of their newsletter, but it ties in that repetition and connects every piece of content that they put out on that first kind of track, if you will, around getting to know Mutiny. They tie it back to here's what we do every single time in a very tactful way. So I always think that's a nice way of doing it because it, at least in written format, it ties back to every single piece of content. That way, if it does surface through SEO or any kind of GPT model, somebody always has that reinforcement without it being overtly sales oriented.
Super smart. I definitely think this is a really important topic for this type of content because, to your point, if the sole goal is just attention, it's like we could create memes, we could create like funny content, and like that's great. And I actually do believe in that if done well. But you could get too down the road on that where you're like actually drawing no intention, like you said, to the
Hmm.
product itself or to the company itself. And so if you make me laugh,
Definitely.
that's great. But like when I move in market 7 months from now because I'm out of contract with a competitor and I'm evaluating other options, do I think of you in that scenario? Like that's the whole goal of this. It's a hard balance to strike, I think, sometimes, because you want to capture as much attention as possible with your market and your TAM. But in order to do that, you can't be too salesy because they're not in market inherently. And so you just have this constant balance of like trying to strike that. And I think you all are doing a great job at that, staying really, like you were talking about, staying really focused on like tactical execution in the trenches, GTM. And that just obviously is such a natural, I mean, that's what you all, GTM fun. Like that's just, so when you think GTM, you want to think like GTM execution, you want to think GTM fund, like that association for you all,
Exactly. Yeah.
and
Our
doing that in
goal
your
is
content.
that when founders go to raise capital, the first company that they think of engaging with is GTM Fund. And it's not a nice
Yep.
to have, it's a need to have. And that is our
Yep.
overall goal. We want the best founders in the world to think of GTM Fund first. And I always like to think, I think you called out attention really well. I always like to think of it as the goal of content is not attention, the goal of content is intentional attention.
Yeah, it's so great to like have these starting points because it's very easy to get into the checklist of like, we need a podcast, we need a YouTube channel, we need social. But you all have started, this whole strategy started from a company strategy of like, what is our differentiator as a company? What is our North Star like positioning as a company that is something that we believe in that like maybe others could disagree with, and so it actually makes it a really strong position to start from, and then that can then
Hmm.
parlay into the content itself rather than just like the first step being what's our podcast about. It's actually like you're letting the company strategy drive that a lot. Yeah, so as you get into the creation of the content, yeah, could you take me through some of that, like what that's looking like? Okay, so it sounds like you've got the newsletter, podcast, your YouTube channel, and then social. Are those the current buckets, or like anything else you all are doing content wise for this as well?
Yeah, that's a great summary. We've got a few different, I always break them down assets and then distribution channels. So we've got newsletter podcasts for assets. We've got digital live events also.
Hmm.
So we throw the occasional digital live event. We recently did one on the operator investors, so more of the angel investing lens. We often do more tactical go-to-market focused ones. That was a bit of a unique, really interesting angle, and that was based on demand and requests that we got. So that's another one of our assets. We also have articles. So sometimes we publish standalone articles that are separate than the newsletter. And then we flow everything through a varying distribution channels. So social, think LinkedIn, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, which is both a distribution channel and an asset. A little bit I consider. And then, a few other channels too that we leverage for distribution.
Yeah. And so, like, at least from outside looking in, it looks like you all have done a really great job of not only execution of this, but consistency of it. Like the number of episodes in your all's podcast archive, for example. And has there been an evolution of the show over time? But like, there's like 500 plus episodes in that feed, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have 500 plus episodes total between two different shows.
Yeah.
So the GTM podcast, we're on about episode 144, is going to air very shortly. And then we also had a different show in the past through Sales Hacker. So that's where that
Smart.
additional kind of delta is. So we
Smart.
use the same
Leverage that
stream,
feed.
but exactly.
Yeah. It's a really good note too, because I think, yeah, every advantage you can give yourself, especially because that audience is similar in like nature. For the most part, sales hacker audience, and then like the GTM podcast audience, there would be a lot of natural overlap there. So not a big ask to try to get everybody to convert over to the new show. Yeah, I guess from a strategy standpoint, is there anything interesting with any of those assets that you've been excited about lately that you've sort of uncovered, or you're seeing what's working, or some cool wins you've seen from it? Anything at all you think, like, if you were kind of helping guide another VP of marketing or head of content on like some learnings here, some recent learnings, like, is there anything you would share on that?
Yeah, great question. All channels are valuable and they all serve different purposes. So they're valuable in their own right. So it depends what you're optimizing for. And it's far more great, I would say, to prioritize quality over quantity and breadth initially. So nailing a specific channel and then continuously expanding.
Agreed.
It took us, for example, we didn't expand into Instagram and TikTok initially. We layered those on afterwards, after we'd kind of gone through our initial ICP one. So from an overall strategy perspective, what I'd recommend is always go where customers are. So find those channels and places that they live, start there, optimize those, and then you can go to more of the tier 2, if you will, channels. And there's 2 different strategies to expand those channels. So you want to optimize for your tier 1s. When you're going to your tier 2s, you can start off by repurposing content to those tier 2s. So rather than really optimizing for them, you're funneling content down to them. So you're growing that presence without leveraging or using the bandwidth necessary to truly optimize it. And then once you hit that inflection point where you can shift to an optimization mode, you can optimize. So when expanding, you have the option. You can either do it from an optimization standpoint out the gate, or you can build from a repurpose, then shift to optimization strategy. Overall, for us, channels that have been kind of interesting. It's always the classic, the evergreen channel. Email has been one of the most impactful channels for us. And when I say email,
Nice.
I don't mean specifically the newsletter. Yes, the newsletter, but we actually distribute both our newsletter and podcast by email.
Yeah.
And that has been extremely impactful because we didn't previously distribute our podcast via email. So that was something that we built. It started probably end of last year, mid last year. And immediately upon starting to leverage the email channel for distribution, we saw at least a 17% increase in listenership. And that has since increased dramatically over time. That was just the immediate benefit. But more notably than the actual direct listenership, I've noticed a huge uptick in brand recognition and impact from it. So sometimes you feel that in different forms. You feel that over social, it might be additional mentions. It might be in person, people mentioning the podcast, for example. So there's different ways that you can keep a pulse on that impact. But leveraging the email channel for distribution was definitely key to expanding that impact. And another interesting channel for us has been YouTube, and one that I would recommend for brands, especially if they're producing any kind of video content already.
Mm,
Ideally, you're optimizing for YouTube to get the most juice from the squeeze, but at a minimum, you can start again that strategy of how do I just repurpose and then optimize for that channel, just to be able to start to get that foundation and build gradually over time, because it does compound. YouTube's very interesting and unique. It's both a channel and a search engine. So it's not just a distribution platform. Content actually compounds over time. And so you're getting the benefit over time. It's also a search engine. So I think it's technically the second largest search engine in the world
mm,
with people looking. And because of that, content is evergreen. So posts that live on platforms like LinkedIn and on TikTok and X and other social platforms do have that specific shelf life associated with their channel. And that is not to say it's not valuable. They're even more beneficial in their own right. Every channel has
mm.
its value in their own. But YouTube's really valuable because that content lives evergreen, and it can also be surfaced via search engines. So SEO for Google, for example, now we're seeing, GPTs actually surfacing it. It is owned by Google. So all of your videos can actually get indexed, which definitely helps with organic traffic and your SEO, or nowadays your AIO strategy.
Yeah, I really like this notion of not feeling bad about your first phase of this on some channels being a repurposed approach. Cause like there is some sentiments from the LinkedIn ecosystem, like this concept that repurposing on any channel is like not a good content strategy. And like, I really like that you're saying this because I don't agree with that. Getting some momentum going is like the key. I'm really big on perfection through iteration. And so thinking you're going to crack the YouTube code, for example, like with your very first video, like your brand new channel, very first video, like you're going to do YouTube first, like the real right way, the odds of that happening are pretty low. It's much better if you like have some video content, like you're saying, already going in the form of a podcast or like, a LinkedIn video or what have you, and then using that on YouTube and using that to start figuring out and playing around with the platform to learn it a little bit more, like using that as a means to learn it. And then phase two, like that optimized phase you were talking about, if you want to really double down on YouTube, okay, cool. Now let's create YouTube first, like truly YouTube first content in that way. So yeah, I'm really glad you're sharing that because I believe there's not necessarily a wrong or right way to do any of this stuff, honestly. It's really just about what order you do it in. But like there's success cases of people doing things like completely different with each other than each other, and they're both winning in their own right. And so the concept of like you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that, I always try to avoid and just like encourage people that, there is no right or wrong way. The main thing is like just being intentional with what your strategy is. Like if you're just throwing up video content on YouTube from like your webinars and stuff as sort of like a repository, but it's a video repository and you're not worried about it, that's fine. If you're just throwing it up and you're like, I want 100,000 views on this, but you're like you're just uploading your webinar, like then you've got a strategy, mix match there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love all of that you're sharing on that.
Yeah, that's such a great call out. I mean, in an ideal world, you would be rolling out each channel in its most optimized form and then iterating upon that. But the reality for a lot of startups, or at least earlier stage companies, is that's probably a little bit harder to do from a bandwidth perspective. So there's
Exactly.
those two paths that you can choose from. Neither is necessarily right or wrong. They're just different strategies. And you need to decide, like you nicely called out, what strategies you're going with and know that. So it's really the alignment of expectations accordingly with that strategy.
Totally. And then yeah, so on some of the maybe on the like growth side of either the newsletter or the podcast, you mentioned like adding the distribution point of the podcast to the email flow was like really successful, and like converting some of that audience over to the show, which is great because now you've got two touch points with them and even more people that can share word of mouth. Like the more people who are listening to the show, the more people who can share word of mouth about the show. So that flywheel can get going even, a little bit more. Any other things levers you've pulled to try to grow either of those audiences, just, the actual sort of subscribers or followers? Sometimes especially with podcasts, it can be hard to like know what specific tactic like drove growth of the show, because like there's not really great analytics, as like with where people came from when they're listening to the podcast and things like that. But yeah, just maybe general sense or like things you've attempted, or has it been like just a compounding thing, which is like the longer we're in market sharing this message, the more audience members we have, the more they bring in their friends because the content is good. So they share the episode and like we get the word of mouth content-based referral engine going. Or yeah, just any insights on that.
Yeah, they're kind of two different tracks, and ideally you're running both at once. One is the compounding organic growth, which inevitably happens with the time in market, and just continuously increasing the quality of the content. Ultimately, content is your product. And so honing in on that craft and perfecting the craft is ultimately the key to organic growth. In that sense, there's a lot of different growth strategies on top that we've layered. So I'll take podcasting, for example. A few different really interesting and impactful tactics. One has been implementing growth loops across our podcast directories. So for any podcast directory, of course, goes out on Apple, Spotify, and so forth, leveraging everything as a feedback loop back to our GTM Now website. So putting in that web page across directories, across our YouTube channel. That way, if somebody really enjoys an episode or finds a singular piece of content, or maybe they get hooked on that singular piece of content, they're always shifted back as a growth loop to our main site for two reasons. One, to ideally have them sign up and want to participate in our GTM Now audience and subscriber base. And then two, to explore additional content, either before or after that former step occurs, to better build their trust, better help them and support them in their journey if there's other content that we have that can help add value to them. So that's one strategy. Another, of course, are listicles. So being listed on top podcast lists that are relevant for your industry. Listicles are being indexed really well right now overall in search engines. So that's really helpful, especially right now at this point in time we are in 2025. Ecosystem. So speaking on other people's podcasts, having other people come on the podcast that have their own podcast, anything that you could do from an ecosystem overlap perspective. And that lends itself to ultimately any asset, so newsletter and podcast, but I'll use the podcast here, for example. Those have been three really interesting areas. Four would be actually looking at Apple and Spotify and being really intentional with what categories you want to get listed in. So they do have, for example, their overall directories and highlights of top 200 tech companies or tech podcasts, for example. And so you can actually try and get listed in that, which then surfaces it to a broader audience beyond your core kind of ecosystem that already knows you exist. So that's great from a discoverability perspective. Ratings and reviews, of course, help with all of those different areas that we've discussed. So actually having a really intentional plan and strategy around acquiring ratings and reviews. And that can come in a few different forms. You can actually ask people directly on your own podcast. I know if you listen to, for example, Diary of a CEO with Stephen Bartlett, he asks every single time for people to actually subscribe. You can also ask to rate and review, what have you. So there's a few different strategies around asking people. You can create campaigns via email to ask your top subscribers. So if you can segment your audience to those that are most engaged or those that comment on your podcast posts, think of those like your super users. And hopefully you can keep adding value and keep adding additional kind of exclusive content for those people, for instance, or any kind of value perk in an exchange. Hopefully they can support with different areas and asks like rating and reviewing the show.
Love
So
those.
those are a couple on the podcast. I can get into any kind of other asset, but those are our few stream. But I'm sure that you've got a list of ideas too. So if there's anything that you think we should add.
Yeah, podcasts are hard to grow. It's an incredibly valuable asset, obviously, but it's a hard one to grow. The beautiful thing with it though is that YouTube excluded, I'm actually even in a lot of ways more bullish on YouTube first podcasts these days than I am audio first podcasts. But the great thing with the audio feeds is that there's no algorithm. Once you've acquired the sort of subscriber, there's no algorithm in between you and them for them to receive that episode. So it's not like the algorithm decides that this episode will appear on their homepage this week and next week it doesn't. Like
Hmm.
you push your new episode out and it goes to them, where that doesn't exist with, most discovery sort of content channels these days. And I'm studying just from like a right now perspective. Spotify is making a lot of improvements right now. Like they are really
Hmm.
pushing new features and updates to their podcast platform, and they're giving a lot more data now. So in Spotify's backend, it will tell you, here's how many people were presented with your podcast, or scroll, like it appeared on their Spotify page when they were on it. Here's how many of those clicked on that episode to read it. Then here's how many hit play. And then here's how long they stayed through. Like, so you almost get the actual full funnel now, from awareness to conversion to consumption. And
Hmm.
that never used to be the case with like audio podcasts. Like Apple doesn't care about giving us that, clearly. I just note that because I think studying those features that Spotify's providing might arm us even better in determining what things should we optimize more for in our marketing of the show. Do we need to optimize from like, if people are seeing the episode but they're not clicking on it, do we need to change our episode titles? Do we need to change like our naming convention of things, our show description, stuff like that? Like they're not clicking for some reason. Or when they're clicking, they're not hitting play. Or when they hit play, they're not making it to the end. Like all of those are different problems that we could solve for. And it's cool to finally get a little more data on that now
Hmm.
from Spotify. I believe your show does not need to be hosted with Spotify to actually get that data anymore. You can actually
Hmm.
just get it on the back end with your profile with them, even if you're not hosting the podcast with them. So that's super nitty gritty, like in the weeds kind of thing. But yeah, that's been an interesting development recently.
It's nice to have it not in a black box anymore, at least to that degree on Spotify. One way that we are able to add that first party data onto podcast tracking to some degree, obviously it's still always a bit of a black box, is on our email distribution channels. You can see
Yep.
who clicks through to it via email distribution. And that way you can start to track those users
Mm,
and see patterns. And if it's maybe a one off, perhaps it was that specific topic that interested them. And then you can reach out to that person with additional resources for that topic. Or if it's somebody that's consuming every single one through your email channel, you can
mm.
reach out to them and say, hey, notice you're doing this. Would you mind rating the show? And if you aren't already subscribing on your platform of choice, subscribing. And that way you can also track profiles over time and understand, what is that composition demographic breakdown. Of course, we get it through YouTube to a greater depth than audio, but sounds like audio is starting to make strides in that space too.
Yeah, I love the feedback loop you're doing here too. Like I think this content still should drive an action, even if we're not asking for a conversion to like an actual
Hmm.
demo or call, a sales call or what have you. And so what you all are, it sounds like you're doing is the action you are requesting or providing is to go back to the GTM Now media platform for another piece of content or like another value add there. And so then you get the signal that the content is working well, because if people are doing that, it means this is resonating and they want more. And then like you said, get them onto the email list. And now you have more first party data on who they are and more value, like a two-way communication you can now have with them. So that's really valuable. I think a lot of people forget that, is we kind of sometimes just create great content, but then we like don't necessarily like ask someone to take a next step. And it doesn't need to be a sales step, but it's like where
Mhm.
I'm activated, I'm interested, I'm like, I like what you're doing. Like, what should I do from here? Sort of thing. And that could be additional resources, assets, or just saying like you said, hit subscribe in your podcast app. Like that will tell us that you like what we're doing, and it'll make sure you get each episode going forward. That's a positive signal that the content is resonating. So
Definitely. Yeah,
yeah, I
ideally for
love that
us,
you're
we
doing
want
that.
to be able to best serve people and support them with additional content. And so, as part of that, our main objective, at least what we're optimizing for right now, every single stage in the funnel, if you will, can be
Yep.
optimized against. And we've got metrics and KPIs and
Mm,
kind of growth plans against each of those. But right now, what we are optimizing for is subscriber capture. And that way we can
mm,
surface additional information as it serves valuable for them. And a
mm.
big part of that is that feedback loop, like you called out. I almost think of it like a bit of a reverse funnel in the sense that, yes, you're funneling people towards that objective, but really they're coming in off of such a variety of different
Yep.
channels. They might come in through a few different nodes and points. And so you're kind of going broad at first.
Yep.
And then narrowing into that subscriber capture, but then you're also going and expanding back
Yes.
out. So it's kind of that reversal once people get there where you're exposing them to additional content. Ideally, you're kind of introducing them to other value add areas. Maybe you have a community tacked on, right? So there's all these different areas. So it is kind of that hourglass.
Yes. Love that. Love that visual. How do you all think about those goals and those metrics and things like that? Because like sometimes how I talk about this is like your TAM essentially. So like we don't want to compare ourselves against just broad YouTubers who have millions of
Mhm.
views and stuff like that. And then we get 3,000 and we think we're not being successful. But if your TAM is only 10,000 buyers total who could buy the product or what have you, and you've got 3,000 people consuming the content, and the only reason they would consume the content is because you're talking about stuff that's relevant to those buyers, you've just captured 30% of your market in your audience
Mhm.
TAM. And so like, how do you think about that? You mentioned the goals you all have. How do you set your content goals in terms of like subscribers to the newsletter or podcast, listens and downloads? Like, do you look at it like that in relation to that might be a little harder to capture that full TAM for you all? But yeah, I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah, definitely. From a planning perspective, I operate on a quarterly basis. So I will look
Mm,
at a specific KPI each quarter, and maybe it's a
mm,
couple, but right now I'm really trying to get focused on one specific quarter and one specific KPI. And then I'll back into strategies around that KPI. And everything is centered around how can I improve this KPI in the lens of a customer? So if I'm a customer and I'm going through, is there a friction point?
mm,
Is there messaging that isn't clear enough? Is the content valuable enough for me? So, how can we better serve our audience? Is the question at every single KPI inflection point.
mm,
And so we'll devise a strategy, execute on that for a quarter. We'll shift KPIs or
mm,
double down on that specific KPI. Eventually, we are expanding the team right now. We'll be operating with multiple different KPIs across areas that we're optimizing for all at once.
mm.
Right now, I am pretty focused every single quarter just by nature of bandwidth right now.
Yep.
But that's generally how we operate from a cadence perspective. And then from a work back around what types and just our overall kind of footprint in the space,
Mm,
you called it out well. We can't necessarily compare ourselves to a health and wellness podcast that is
right.
much more broad and applicable to more people. There's only so many people in the world that are going to really care about the growth go to market tactics behind company growth. And so, accordingly, we don't hold ourselves to those same overall kind of Everest subscriber numbers. Everybody's
Mm,
Everest is different based on the quality, and that's always the most important. So again, coming back and flipping it back on, we don't really care about, just growing for the sake of numbers. We want to be serving the right valuable content to our audience. And if we are, and that hypothesis holds true, then our subscriber count will increase accordingly. And that increase is not infinite, and that's okay because quality over quantity. So, for example, we do actually have partners and brands that we're fortunate to work with as sponsors on our podcast and help with their distribution in addition to distributing the content that we share. And we're part of a podcast campaign right now. We're coming up this year with a company that is involved with most podcasts are, you know, 5x the size of ours because they're more greatly in the D2C space.
Mm.
So we are kind of coming in as this really niche focused podcast that speaks to a specific audience that falls within their ICP, whereas the other ones cover other ICPs. And so we know that we could be valuable for our audience. We're not going to change, our mission, our content to try and obtain any kind of additional numeric subscriber goals or anything of the sort. Always value for the customer first. And then I think that's kind of a good outcome where you can see it doesn't matter based on the exact number of subscribers. It doesn't matter that, D2C brands that we're engaging with have 5x the subscribers that we are in this podcast campaign. We are very targeted on a specific ICP, and that ICP is helpful for other brands to get in front of too and share their value and mission.
Yeah, totally agree. It's actually pretty easy to game numbers. So it's like, if we want to just game numbers, we can do that. But it's like, then most of the people that represent those numbers are not the right people. So it's literally defeating the entire purpose of what we're doing, which is like,
it's like a
here's the
sales
specific
funnel.
people that we want to talk to. And now most of our audience is not those people. So
Exactly. And then it doesn't serve anyone's benefit because just like a sales funnel for a SaaS company, if you
yeah,
bloat it with unqualified leads, you're going to end up with inefficiencies for your sales team. Similarly, if you bloat an audience with the folks that the content isn't going to resonate with, you're going to get lower engagement rate, which then in turn makes it more challenging for that content to be surfaced to the people that will get benefit from it.
one question here around the personal brand side of some of the GTM fund partners who are helping with the content. Like, there is this dynamic sometimes where the sort of hosts of the podcast or thought leaders that are a part of the company, either in leadership roles or CEO or founder, there's this balance of like how much time they have available to contribute to the content. But like, we know that will sort of put a multiplier effect on the success of it if they're able to. So how would you recommend somebody who's working with the sort of quote unquote thought leader who's the face of the content brand, but that person is also obviously like the CEO or high level exec of the company, and they don't have a lot of time? And so how do you kind of optimize that in general?
One is the actual content production side, and then two is the distribution. And often I've seen the bandwidth constraint come in on either side and sometimes both. So the content production side, a few different areas I've seen work really well. And again, fortunately for GTM Fund, everyone is very bought into media, bought into content. So this is more when I share these kind of tactics, working with portfolio companies, working and advising with other marketers and, other marketers at other VCs that are looking for advice on what to do because executives are busy, right? And so production wise, concision and time efficiency is most helpful. So blocking, for example, an hour per week to actually produce that content. And what that typically looks like, at least right now, for a lot of companies, is jumping on a Zoom call, recording it, asking a lot of pointed questions, transcribing that, turning it into different assets. The distribution side is where if they don't have time to post it from their own socials, that can be a challenge. So you can either create an enablement doc. That way it's super easy for them to go in, copy, paste. And, LinkedIn has great native schedulers. They can actually schedule it out for the whole week. That way they don't have to think about it the rest of the week. You can also put it in their calendar. That way it's there every single day. They know exactly what to post, super easy. Or you can also get access for yourself or someone else to their account and actually do that posting on their behalf. So those are two different options there. And then of course, for distribution channels that you have access to, it's a lot more straightforward from a email channel and so forth that you don't actually need personal credentials.
And a lot of it just ultimately, like, if you're tasked with trying to power that and there's just a lot of friction, like, sometimes there's only so much you can do to where the
Yeah.
executive has to be bought in, like, and
Yeah.
And maybe not to say that they're not, because they are genuinely like extremely busy, but we can't say we want to do this strategy, but then not fund or resource it from like a time and team perspective to then actually do it. So we just have to make sure that like if it's a goal and a strategy, then we have to prioritize the execution. And that's everybody, including the executive and the thought
Hmm.
leader and the CEO.
Education coming in as a big component because it's hard to tell how much of a lift content will be. And
Yeah.
frankly, it's a pretty heavy lift,
Yeah.
as you know,
Yes. Yeah.
production wise. And so, educating your executives, educating your team continuously just on this is what we're trying to achieve. This is what it's going to take. This is how much time it takes from everyone,
Yep.
but this is the result. This is why we're doing it. And constantly shifting them back to that
Yes.
outcome. That way, it's reinforcing the investment of their time, but also educating them on, we can't wave a magic wand and suddenly you've got 100,000 LinkedIn followers. This is what it's actually going to
Exactly.
take. And this is the time requirement. But if you
Yep.
always loop back, they'll see the value and continuously get bought in. I think it's very easy to just feel frustrated by it, but it is something that is, like classic marketing. Everyone's got an opinion on it in an
Yeah.
organization. Everyone's got a preconceived notion of content. And sometimes that doesn't necessarily reflect how much time is required to actually produce that content.
I love that reminder because as like leaders of companies, that's one of their main jobs is to remind people on the team over and over and over again our mission, our vision, our values, what we're doing. And it's almost like we can reverse that on them. Like in this case, which is just being on offense about why we're doing this content, what it will lead to, how we can optimize it together, like not sort of assuming that they already know these things or like in the midst of their 37 Zoom calls this week will remember every detail about the strategy. I definitely agree with time blocking. I even recommend people like one 90-minute session a month is like a starting point that could power a lot of content for that month. Just one single 90-minute session. You can knock out a
Yeah,
few
that's a
podcast
great
episodes, or
recommendation.
you could do, just Q&A, like thought leadership content in that one block.
Definitely.
Well, to wrap up, like things are evolving, I think, with like just content and marketing like really quickly now. I'm genuinely pretty excited about how it's evolving and just the future of it, like what opportunities there are. Like I'm curious, is there anything you're excited about either with like the specific things you all are thinking about you might execute or just in general from like a content strategy perspective, going forward here in the rest of 25 and into 2026?
Well, it is changing dramatically, of course, with AI. So, what I'm really excited about is the creativity that's going to be unlocked.
Yeah.
And not by just simply unlocked, but it's going to be necessitated
Mhm.
because the production side is only getting easier and easier in terms of the actual repurposing of content itself, distributing that content. So, what that leaves as that moat is really the creativity that goes into it,
Yep.
in addition to, I believe, the network effect around content and media.
Mm.
So, that's one that is much harder to replicate, how you're infusing your ecosystem within your content, how you're supporting and leveraging your ecosystem for distribution and really rising together and helping from that ecosystem led growth approach in a way
Mm.
of going to market together to help your ICP together. If you've got a similar ICP, if you've got overlapping ICPs, those are all areas that at the end of the day, ideally every piece of content is a huge value add and you can actually partner with different companies to help provide that all-encompassing view for startups, for operators, for anyone looking for support in those areas. So I'm really excited about the ecosystem approach that is emerging even more heavily with the advent of AI. And then I'm really
Mm.
excited about the creativity that it's unlocking and necessitating by way of everything just simply becoming more efficient.
Yep. Getting back to the
And
basics
of
of
course, I'm excited for some of the tools. I'm always I'm always don't get distracted by shiny objects. Always keep an eye, keep a pulse on every single shiny object, keep
Yeah.
tabs, experiment. But consistency and simply doing the thing is always more effective than jumping strategy.
Right.
But I'm really excited about some of the tools coming out that just simply add to that creativity, add to that efficiency. So I'm excited to see what else kind of comes out. I've seen some really cool agentic flows that are actually pushing to specific distribution channels, just
Mm,
again, optimizing from that efficiency perspective. So rather than taking everything, shifting it to different systems, it's actually pushing as part of the workflow to those systems and just little things like that that are probably a little bit nerdy when it's on the operational side. But I think just add a huge unlock for startups, especially because
yes.
it just makes it so much easier for them to have that unlock and get started with content and hopefully lean into the power of media.
Think we are about to see like a big wave of creativity and kind of getting back to the basics of marketing, which creativity is the basis of marketing, in general. And so now, like, if we don't have to be so tied down to the tasks as much,
Mhm.
now it's like, okay, what are we actually doing here? Like with this piece of content or this content pillar or this show or this newsletter. Yeah, I think it's a great time to be a marketer and a great time to be a content
Yeah.
marketer overall.
Definitely. There's a huge narrative around content marketing as it grows, but also the concern around AI. But I agree with you. I think it's actually a huge unlock and the most
Yes.
exciting time to be in content marketing.
Yes. And everybody listening, I would recommend very highly to go check out GTM Now and all the media platforms, the newsletter, the podcast, social, that everything that Sophie and the team are doing. Because yeah, I consider it, a really elite execution for all this stuff. And yeah, other than that, Sophie, anywhere else you would recommend people to go if they want to connect with you?
Thank you for the kind words. Really appreciate it. And likewise for yourself too. LinkedIn is
Thank
a
you.
great place for getting in touch with me. So feel free to reach out there, connect, shoot me a DM. I'm also on Twitter, but LinkedIn is definitely best place to actually get in touch.
All right. Great. Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you. Honored to be here. Thank you for having me, Eric.